Very much. I can't compete with this. I'm just going to let this loop for a few seconds. I'm Rupert Breheny, and I hope by the end of this presentation, I will have taught you all how to fly. Isn't this beautiful? Have you ever had the dream where you just take 1, 2, 3 running steps and leap off the ground, and then you're just up in the air, swooping over buildings or deserts, something a bit like this? I think I spend too much of my waking moments trying to get back into that dream state. And the closest I've ever gotten to it is actually with Google Earth VR, which I'm going to tell you a little about just now. Just very quickly, I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but how many of you have actually had a chance to play with it? You want to give me a hand? Okay, so quite a few of you. Perfect, so you know what I'm talking about. So as a bit of a background, I'm a program manager at Google, and a couple of years ago I had the good fortune to run a very small team that worked on the visual performance, but I'm actually presenting the work of my colleagues in UX, Adam Glazer, Per Carlson, and Dominic Kaiser, who are the real heroes here, but I'm going to show you some amazing work they did on the actual front end. And it looks like this. The sharp-eyed amongst you, if you were as obsessed with NASA as I was back in the early 70s, without giving too much away, this is our rendition of a famous photograph called The Blue Marble. This scene of Earth was seen by only 3 people in all of human history. There was a perfect alignment of the Apollo 17 heading off on a 2-week trip to the moon. And in actual fact, the daylight line is wrong here, but they got this perfect encapsulated view of the entire planet, and it just became this cultural touchstone that everybody sees us as one connected system. But very few people have ever seen it like this. But what if we could take this image and put it into the hand of every school child or every old age pensioner or just anybody who's had that fascination with maps or geography or the world they live in? It could be a truly, truly magical experience. I'm probably going to say magical too much. I hope you'll forgive me for that. So how do we do it? Well, we have satellites taking terrain photographs, and we have high-altitude aircraft giving us photogrammetry based on feature detection on the ground, and we create something that looks a bit of a mess like this, and by layering up some red, green, and blue on the pixels, we'll give you a 3D map that looks like this. Now, you're seeing it on a big screen behind me. Not everybody gets this as immersive a view. And so for the most part, people are looking at it on a tablet or on a window of a desktop machine, but they're not really in it. And we wanted to know how we could take that data that we've collected for 10 years and present it in a way that nobody had ever seen before. And of course, VR seemed like the right way to do it. Cardboard was probably not the platform of choice, but when we did launch Cardboard, we had a very early demo of what it would look like exploring our geodata in, I don't even know how many frames per second it was, but it was not a lot. But there was a little whiff of something there. You could get a sense of it really turning into something great with a bit more dedicated effort, which is exactly what we did for a couple of years. Now, with a desktop machine, you have all the power of a games console, and you can create these virtual worlds. And if any of you have played Grand Theft Auto, you realize you can drive from one point on the map to somewhere else 20 minutes later and never have a loading screen. Now, the problem is we have the entire planet to navigate, which you'd be surprised how quickly people like to zip and swoop and fly around. And so we have to come up with some very novel ways of getting that in memory and rendering it 90 frames per second to give you a proper smooth VR experience. And we do it with things like the frustum. This is a cone that we send out and just determine what geometry is in front of us. It's high resolution, nearer the camera point and lower further away. And then we predict a little bit the direction of the head moving, and so we can preemptively load more meshes, more geometry, more pixels to left and right. And so with a few of these little tweaks, we have this very highly performing system, which was super important for us, because if any of you are like me, I get very, very sick very, very quickly. And if you are actively doing VR development, don't hate the person on your team that needs a bucket every time you give them something super immersive. Thank that person, because they are your best quality assurance tester you will have. And speaking of which, oh, I think my videos aren't going to play. Is that possible? Well, we'll find out. Okay, so this is where we wanted to get to with this, the kind of visual fidelity. We want these atmospherics. We want to have light bending through the atmosphere. We want a very high frame rate, as I mentioned. And we do it by a series of navigation steps. Sorry, I'm jumping. If we have trouble with these videos, I may want to have a look at that, because a lot of what I'm doing is... Yeah, okay, that would be great, thank you. I'm usually not on Keynote, it's usually on slides, but this is the one. Okay, no, we're fine. I think we're okay. So sorry, navigation, how do you get around when you have the whole planet to get around? And so the immediate thing that struck us, and you bear in mind we were doing this fairly early on, not a lot of the grammar of VR exploration had been developed at that point. And so the obvious thing for us was with very early hardware in our hands with a couple of buttons on a rudimentary 3D printed controller. And what one of the buttons would allow us to do was to point at somewhere, click a button, and you would just appear there. Now the problem with that is it's very effective, but you have this complete context loss of everything that's around you. And so what would tend to happen, you were just pointing at a mountain, you wanted to be on the mountain, you were on the mountain, but because it's all spread out in front of you, you lose the sense of the transition there and the idea of what you were trying to figure out in the first place. So it's not actually an ideal mechanic. So we tried a couple of other things. This was our scaling mechanic with another button, which is animating also. So this is a nice way of getting around. You can scale up, take a few giant steps, go somewhere new, and scale down. But if you see what would happen there, when you scale back down, the stuff you were interested in disappears behind you or away from you, and you get a little bit confused. And again, there's that loss of context. So we weren't there yet. And again, we're trying in very early hardware. We haven't finalized all of these mechanisms. So the next thing we tried was teleporting, but with steps in the way. So instead of you getting a sense of just jumping 10 miles and appearing somewhere, if we broke it down into a series of we kind of set you halfway there, and then half of that distance, half of that distance. You never quite got there, but you did get a sense of the transition. But it left people with slight vertigo, because it was almost as if you were in one of these parascending rigs, and you were lifted up off your feet, and below you was this huge drop, and you knew subconsciously that you were in a room, just in the background. It was there in your head. But there was something about this very real visceral experience that made you panic when you saw the floor drop away. So that didn't work either. So then we tried something else, which was the scale and step teleport. We were actually doing a couple of interactions with a couple of different sets of buttons, and it's just too complicated. We're still not there. We had not figured this out, and it was taking us a long time. However, we finally came up with this solution. Now, I know it's kind of the obvious one, and it was one we avoided earlier, because the issue we have with something like this is nausea. So you would probably know one of the rules in creating VR 101 is don't accelerate the user in a way that they're getting different information from their eyes as compared to what their ears are telling you. So when you contradict the vestibular system, you just feel dizzy and probably want to fall over again. So we were stuck. People were kind of leaning against walls, feeling sick, dry heaving. That wasn't the experience we wanted to leave people with. And so what are we going to do? So the problems were, if we teleport, people don't feel sick, but you lost the sense of the travel. And if we flew, you got this whole idea of you're still navigating, you were aware of your surroundings, but you just felt miserable. And so everything you have when you're trying to create a good user experience is a set of compromises. There is no ideal. And so we're kind of stuck between these four different ways. Is it going to be easy to use? Is it going to make you sick? Are you going to lose the context of where you are? Or if we keep the context, do you lose the immersion? And so we came up with this. So you've seen this. I think this is fairly standard now. I've seen it in quite a few different VR experiences for these kind of movements, and you'll recognize a beautiful Italian scene, which again is not animating on my machine, but just imagine you're swooping through this landscape. And give me a moment, because I really would like to show you these. Perhaps it's a difference between the way my screens are set up. Or if any of the previous presenters have had trouble with getting their videos playing, now would be a good time to tell me. I'm going to mirror these. Is that any better? No, okay, no videos for you. I'm so sorry. You get a lovely kind of transition through here, but because you've got this blanked out area on either side, we call it tunnel vision. It's this idea that what makes people nauseous when you get this rapid movement, it's sort of like when you are on a ship and the ship is swaying back and forth, but you're seeing this fixed thing. It's that mismatch. But when you see high contrast areas and the peripheral vision is just playing havoc with you, and so you want to have something that just cuts out that view. And you'll find that you don't even have to cut that much out. It just gives you the sense of being there in the room. And then the specifics of how we did it, where there were some layers added on top, where we had the horizon line. I think if you can see just, well, there's an arrow pointing there. You would always get that stretching out. And then a little grid pattern on the floor. And so that matched what we did with the scaling, where the decision we took when we did fly around, you weren't just lifting off the ground, you were actually getting bigger, but it meant that the ground plane that was always there projected anytime you did these big movements, you would have this solidity to it, and so you wouldn't feel out of place. So there was our solution to this. It was a compromise. There was a bit of a loss of immersion, but it was acceptable to us. And the point is, you want to send people home happy, not feeling like they've just gone half an hour on a heaving boat, something like that. So the next thing we tried was, if we take scaling to the logical conclusion, how far can we go? And you could literally be a colossus striding the world, which was quite exciting because you just felt suddenly this godlike status, but you were looking down and you just saw this rapidly decreasing ball under your feet. And that also made people a little bit wary, because you all of a sudden felt like a circus elephant on some giant rolling ball. And people again felt a little bit queasy on that. So there was a point where if you felt you were going to fall off this ball, we needed a slightly different way of presenting that view. And we did it very simply with moving the earth up and putting it in front of you. And for those of you who've tried, we have usually your non-dominant hand. You're going to flip between this earth in front of you view and then the underneath you. When you zoom in for a closer look, Venice looks amazing in 3D. You absolutely should try it. Okay, this one works. That's good. And so you get something like this. And there is something just indescribable about having this planet in front of you, full scale, knowing that you can zip in to one at any point within 2 seconds. It's an incredibly powerful feeling. And you have the beauty of this imagery. The clouds are live. And if you want to follow along weather in a very interesting way, wait till there's a giant cyclone. Just open up Earth on your desktop, or better in VR. You can just walk around it and you see these weather patterns move. It's usually about 15 minutes delay. But the idea that you can have this satellite view from kind of far orbit at any point, it's really quite remarkable. So it's a beautiful thing. So the basic drag, yes, animating, perfect. The drag thing seemed to be another way that was going to allow us to move around at speed. And it kind of seems simple enough. You want to point somewhere. It's almost like if you played the Zelda games, the hook shot, you can jump around to places. But for us, it's always a sense of you're not moving your feet are telling you you're rooted to the floor, and you're dragging the scenery around you. And so it feels very kind of real to you, which is great until you do something like this, which is if you drag the back of that room and suddenly it hits you, you cower. You can't not do it. Your brain is telling you that you're in great peril. So again, it's another one of these issues that it didn't seem like it would be a thing at the time, but until you test, and have a variety of users that hopefully haven't used your product so many times that they've become just overused to it, you come up with insights like this. And so this was a very elegant solution. So the problem, as I say, is you're just hitting stuff. And so we created something called the cone drag. So you see the orange line here. We basically take your feet as either standing on the pinnacle of a cone or on the bottom, and then drawing a line up to the area you're dragging yourself to. And so you have that nice smooth transition, and then you scale a little bit as you go. And that was the best of all worlds. You never, or it minimizes the amount of time you hit things. Sometimes you can walk into scenery, and we prefer that doesn't happen. But this actually solved the majority of those cases. And yes, we do have one working here. So this is almost like Spider-Man view. So if you want to really try this technique out, do it in somewhere like Manhattan, where we have these beautiful 3D buildings, and you can just go jumping around like a maniac. So that was our solution for locomotion. Scaled flying, tunnel vision stopped you getting nauseous. The cone drag stopped you hitting your head with skyscrapers, which isn't fun unless they fall over, Godzilla-like, and we aren't going to code that in there. And then the globe in front from when you got too far away and just wanted to get this broad view right there. So what came next? How do we increase the immersion? So we have this great imagery, but as our previous speaker says, people underestimate the power of sound, and it was important for us that we wanted to give you that same sense of being there as we did with photography. Can we do it with sound as well? And so unfortunately, I've got no sounds on here, but we elected to record a variety of different sounds and then play them back in a blended fashion, depending the altitude or the time of day you found yourself at. And so on the ground level, if it was during the day, you would hear some birdsong or a bit of traffic. If it was nighttime, there might be crickets chirping. And a bit higher up, you would get the sort of whoosh of air, the sort of thing you might hear if you're high up on top of a skyscraper looking down, and just that sense of being up. And then even higher, we kind of move to these sort of beautiful chord-like sort of music of the spheres type thing. And then some deeper, more bass sounds out in space when you have this view at a distance, which just gives it this weird sense of gravitas. And if you weren't actively listening to the sound, you might not quite know, well, it feels as majestic as it does. But again, just try it, and this time have an ear out for the sound in particular, because we also use it for haptics and interactions. So if you drag the earth from a distance, you hear this kind of low grumbling sound. And we got that just from tying a rope around a rock and dragging it, just something as literal as that. You can point to the sun in the sky and drag it across. And when you look up and you see the sun directly, there's a vague sort of sizzling sound. Our sound designer actually fried up a batch of bacon and recorded that. So it's amazing how the obvious solutions can just sort of turn into something you might not quite place, but you bring this sort of sense memory to it. And so we had all these nice ways of kind of giving you this deeper sensation of height and speed and weight and resistance that were important for us to say, this isn't some weightless video game, this is a real place with real consequences. And so we had this deep, deep immersive view like this. You could get inside Earth imagery in a way that you never could before. And it was a great deal of fun to have. But if you have some of that nausea susceptibility, you probably don't like this image very much. And partly it's because it's too janky. It's a little bit jaggy there. So what you have with the laser pointer, the further away you point, what we're basically doing now is using the same drag mechanic when the Earth was in front of you. And because your pointer is so far away, every tiny little change you make is basically amplified. And so just the whole scene moves too much, and it just feels uncomfortable. It's a little prickly. And so another little thing we added here was the idea of springiness in the interactions. And so you can imagine that if you wanted to model this as physics, and if you remember any of this from school, or if you do this professionally now, there's that little bit of overcoming static friction you need. If you're pushing anything heavy, a piece of furniture across your carpet, you need a little bit of a push, and then it gives, and you start sliding it across. And then a little more, it takes less energy to kind of accelerate it at that point. And so we've coded some of that physics in, and it just gives you a sort of an input that just feels more real. And I'll show you an animation of that in a minute. And the other thing we did, instead of that laser pointer at distance, which made it feel a bit fidgety, we gave you almost like a water hose, which allows you to have larger movements close by and actually have it drop down into place in front of you. Water hose is a nice way of describing that interaction, but it allows you to have slightly more finesse at distance. And when we combine the two, we get this smooth motion, which makes you just feel more comfortable. It just starts to feel real. It starts to behave like a real physical object would if you genuinely had a giant ray coming out and you could move stuff around. So the red is the actual literal pointing location of your laser if it was just coming out straight, but we code that slight sort of laziness in. It feels like slightly elastic. It kind of bends. It's a bit like a Ghostbusters thing where it kind of holds on to a bit of scenery and then you can't quite snap it away. And if we look at it just really smoothly, it's one of these things that you don't necessarily realize it's doing this until you see the before and after, and it just makes it a much more comfortable experience. And speed generally, again, we're coming back to this idea, you don't accelerate somebody through space because it's at odds with the ears and the eyes. And so we chose to have this constant room scale space. And this one's difficult to explain. So if you can imagine that when we scale up or down, we're scaling the geometry, and what we emulate is you moving at walking speed in the room you're in through that geometry, and it gives you this kind of experience. Now, as we zoom in, you'll find that you're basically reduced to walking space as if it was the real world, and you've had all this power at your fingertips. You can just zoom through so much of this, and it just feels very muddy. So yes, it doesn't give you the sense of nausea, but then it doesn't give you the sense of power that you become a little bit addicted to as you play around with this. And so we chose to do this power curve, which again felt like it was moving a bit too slow at distance, so we kind of flipped it out a bit at a certain scale where we just hit that kind of constant speed again. And what it looks like is you have that sense of maybe flying again, even at low level, so you never quite hit walking speed, but it gives you this smooth transition between the small, local, and the large stuff in the distance. And this is the one that tested the best for us in our UX. Street view, not everywhere has stunning 3D. There's a lot of cities that we either can't fly or don't have permission to or are too expensive. And so if you live in Western Europe, obviously a lot of this is mapped. But some countries aren't so lucky. And I will show you, yeah, okay, imagine if you will, this is Dominic, this is the founder of the Earth VR team. He's walking around and he is looking and he's seeing some globes dotted around the Manhattan skyline. And when you walk over to the globes, you can point, they open up, but it's kind of odd looking because we've spent all this time trying to create a very realistic rendition of the world as it is, and then we break that illusion by having these weird floating balls everywhere. So we swapped it out a little bit. For somewhere like this, it's important. We want to give you access to different geometry or different imagery. This is Tel Aviv. We don't have it in 3D. And it's interesting, but it's not engaging like the full zooming in and out of streets. You wouldn't want to zoom in too close to this because there's nothing to see. And we've got all this imagery stored up from the Street View driving cars and user-generated content, all of this stuff. Any of you can go out and take this imagery. And this, in VR, is a great way of seeing it, just being there, looking around as if you were there again. Paris, as you know, but unfortunately there's no audio in any of these. We never actually recorded audio on our Street View images, but I would love for us to do that at some point. But you get this sense of the hustle, the bustle, there's activity there. It feels like a living, breathing space in a way sometimes the Earth geometry doesn't give you. And so oh wow, it's getting really interesting now, isn't it? So this is our standard user interface for seeing Street View on a regular map, where we have this little blue outlines that you drop our Pegman mascot in. And then this is us trying to emulate it on Earth natively. And it just, again, it looks weird. It's kind of like Manhattan has been flooded. It was expensive from a rendering perspective, and you just, in very densely Street View served places, it really kind of messed it up. So we had to come at another solution for that. And this was one of our less spoken about, the better experiments. At the end of this, you just felt like you were murdering some poor little puppet. So we chose not to go with this particular one, and it wasn't a particularly efficient way either. So, you know, if it's somebody you really don't like, maybe you can wrap the face on there, but this was considered a let's not explore this further experiment. So what we did have was, at this point, we'd already decided to have a laser pointer in one hand, where we put a globe in the other hand. And when you bring them together, you can do some quite interesting things. So you've got this little model of the Earth, quite literally in the palm of your hand. And you can point to it any time with your laser and just jump very quickly if you don't want to go to the whole rigmarole of flying 15 seconds. And then we decided at a certain level above scenery, we could flip it over to a Street View bubble there with a little pulse, a little vibration in your hand, and it tells you you're in Street View territory. I'm going to check the time. How are we doing for time? Okay. And then you get something like this, which you also can't see, but take it from me, what happens as you zoom in, you see this globe held in front of you, and you get closer to the ground, it'll do a little shimmer, there's a brief moment of loading, and then you have it replaced with this sort of magic ball where you get a view into a 360 sphere that you can look around a little bit to preview in your hand, and then, okay, here's a good version. And then when you get close enough to the ground, it looks where your feet are. It sees if there is 360 available, and then it just gives you this nice interaction. Now, maybe it was a bit quick here, but we had the laser pointer navigation. It's like a quick point and a click. I don't think it's so clear, but that was one way of interacting with the spheres. And the other way was just to put it on your head like a helmet. And I think that's the same mechanism that the lab does. It's kind of something that people already sort of associate with these like crystal balls. I think they're a very fun way of interacting with that technology. So there we go. So how we solved the Street View problem, we needed to be discoverable. We did it with a pulse and a flash, and obviously this thing, if it's not always in your eye line, but it's a very obvious magic ball there. And then we have the intuitive enter and exit into the sphere. There's multiple ways you can get into these, so hopefully people realize it's something they can have this interaction with. And so what was the response? Well, people seemed to like it. People wrote nice reviews. People spent a lot of time in it, and that was very exciting to hear. But the stories I like best are stories I hope you've heard from your friends and your families. And it's basically, it isn't just a tool for geography students or for somebody interested in 3D rendering, it becomes a tool for storytelling. Because as many people have told me, they've used it to find the town or the village they grew up in, or maybe where they met their partner, or where their kids were raised, or where they went on holiday, or they planned a skiing trip or a hiking trail, something like this. But there's something really delightful about sitting in a room with somebody in VR who's not using it as an isolating experience, but is actually sharing experiences with you that you can follow along by looking at the monitor connected to your PC. So I hope all of you have an opportunity to share some of your stories via Google Earth with your friends and families, and learn a little bit about the world as you do. Thank you very much.